In fact, that had its own challenge because I was around her a lot by the virtue of just being in this work from home and lockdown situation, to the point that I was breastfeeding her till about 3 years, like 2.5 to 2 years, 8 months. And breastfeeding is exhausting. It's trying to find the space to breastfeed within meetings, to breastfeed when she wakes up. And it is also sucking a lot of nutrition out of the mother. And there's not enough awareness, I feel, on if you want to continue to breastfeed your child, you need other support systems to work. And we were living in a pandemic. So in my mind, I was like, if I want a healthy child, I better breastfeed this child. My struggles actually came from being surrounded a lot with her, that I was just not finding the space enough to be by myself.
Hello listeners, my name is Mridvika and this is Just an Ordinary Mom podcast. I really am just an ordinary mom to twin boys with a high-speed career, and this podcast is to tell the stories of ordinary moms doing extraordinary things. On our show today, we have Shrutika Jadhav, who holds a double master's degree, an MBA in HR from Wellington Institute and a public policy degree from Singapore. She is currently an associate director at Dasra and has spent a decade working at the intersection of philanthropy and impact. Shrutika's vulnerability is the only reason you should listen to this episode. She has shared about her struggles of managing work as a new mother, admitted that not being able to find time for herself and being constantly consumed in the responsibility of childcare during lockdown left her feeling inadequate and caused her to burn out completely. She also talks about how her husband's mental health condition changed her role in their marriage and how she chose to look beyond the illness to help her partner manage his condition. Shrutika is unapologetically ambitious for herself, but also knows what to prioritize to build the life she wants for herself. Welcome, Shrutika. Thank you so much for making the time to come and speak to me about your journey.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
Shrutika, why don't we start with your childhood, which often is the first influence, as you'd understand, that shapes our worldview. Tell me a little bit about your growing up years, your parents, family, your neighborhood, and everything in between.
So I grew up in a regular middle class family. We were 2 daughters, so just me and my sister. And as is with any, I think, kind of, regular middle class home, there was a lot of importance on like education. So it was just like, you have to study well, you have to do well. And my sister was really good. Like, she would be one of those whose names would be, I still remember, on the board every time at the end of, the exam or open house. And I was as average as it can get. And I actually did not enjoy school. I don't think the schooling setup was like for me, but I don't have any major memories from that time either. So that was just like as normal as it can get. But I think a few things that were definitely kind of seeded during that time was a little bit around, you have to study well if you want to do well. And I knew I wasn't like the star student, but I knew that I was trying to find my path and what good education or learning kind of meant for me. My father was working, so he was kind of traveling a lot. And we would see him like working really hard, like traveling, being out in the field for his work, etc. And I think that also seeded a little bit of, okay, there's a lot of hard work that goes into, making ends meet and giving a good education to your family or your children, etc. My mother was a homemaker, but of course she was also working all the time, kind of making sure we were fed well, taken care of, etc. But I do think with my mom, there was a little bit, this wasn't my choice, or maybe I could have had it differently. She grew up in a much more conservative home where it was women were not supposed to work, and so it wasn't like she was encouraged to study further or take up a job, etc. And so for her, this was, I think it was a little bit like somebody made the choice for her. I think that was another thing that kind of was seeded in my childhood growing up, was like, no, nobody can make that choice for me. I think I should make a choice for myself. She was, of course, is a great mom and did a lot of, helped us in how we grew up, etc. A lot of influences. But I always wonder, I don't think it was her choice. I think it was, maybe if she had a different choice, maybe she would have lived her life differently. So those were a little bit of my founding years.
Did it bother you to see your mom not getting the opportunity to pursue her fullest potential since someone else made the choice for her?
I don't think it bothered me then, very clearly. But I think what I could see was that my mother was not happy in terms of, there was always some conversation around how it probably could have been different. or opportunities that were missed or, something like that. Again, not explicitly. We were, of course, growing up, things were great. But there was always a little bit of like, what if, I think. That, again, something that she may not have explicitly said, but we picked up. So I think it didn't bother me then, but it was definitely a question that was always in my mind. And now when I think about, and I'm sure I'll come to that in a minute, but think about choices I made, I think some of that definitely has played into it. And I think it was probably her way of also pushing us, right? Like, you make the choice and you make that decision.
How did you go from being a major in arts and psychology to studying HR and then business school, and then you also went to do public policy in Singapore? How did you choose these courses for yourself?
Yeah, I think now when I think about it, I've had quite a diverse career path. But honestly, it was, some of it was, again, kind of going with the flow. I think till I was in college, I didn't know what I still wanted to do. And, that was a traditional arts, commerce, science kind of a setup. And as I mentioned, I wasn't great at studies. It wasn't like I was ranking in the top 10. So arts was a very normal choice to be taken, like, okay, logical, do that. But actually, when I got into arts and I got introduced to psychology, and now, of course, I know a lot about myself, I enjoy working with people. And I enjoy working more sort of helping, supporting, coaching, teaching. All of that is something that gives me a lot of joy. And I think psychology came close to that because a little bit of about like understanding human behavior, counseling, a lot of our projects were around that. So I immersed myself a lot into that. And I was actually doing well and I was enjoying. If I asked my parents, they say when you start going to college is when we started truly seeing you in your element. College had a lot of extracurricular activities. So, I would do a little bit here, a little bit there. Had a lot of was sort of away from that school kind of setup. So I think college really worked. But as I was doing that, I noticed also that there was very limited career paths. This was like almost 20 years ago when I was in college. So it was like, okay, if you did psychology, there were very limited pathways to actually make a career in it. You would become a counselor. Many of them are going abroad to take additional certifications, etc. And I was like, maybe that's not as rigorous as in terms of the path that possibly what I want to build for myself. So I decided to apply for business school. And it was in business school where somehow, I don't know, again, psychology, HR, all related because it's about working with people. But I also feel like there was a little bit of like, as a woman, HR is like what you should do, because where will you do marketing and sales and be on the field? And, it's not like you have to travel a lot, and how can like women don't do that because then you can't leave your home. And there was like a lot of this chatter, which nobody sat down and had that conversation with me. But I think it was again like very subtle. It was everywhere. Most girls were taking HR. They would see very few going for like business or marketing, like finance or marketing, etc. So it was like this, again, I felt like I went with the flow that time and I did HR. But when I started working my first job, I think I realized that, okay, I just studied so much and it's not adding a lot of meaning to my life. So again, there was a question, like, is this really the path that I want to take for myself, and what else can I do? So those were some of the questions that were in my mind.
So before you ventured into the social sector, you were at one of the India's largest banks. What about that role prompted you to shift radically from working your way up in a corporate setup to making the shift to getting selected for the founding batch of Teach for India Fellowship Program? Did you know back then that you'd be doing this for a significant portion of your life?
No, I absolutely did not. Actually, 2008, when I got into as a management trainee, it was a pretty significant year because one, I was already asking myself this. And I think if you ask my parents, they would probably be like, this girl is never happy. Like, you were first doing this, then now you want to do this. Like, I was sort of like this, stay in one place, focus, do. But I feel like that wasn't me. I was actually pushing myself to figure out where can I make my career, what my path is. And I kudos to my parents because they gave me the flexibility to think that way and like have that space as well. So I already was beginning to ask these questions. And then 2008 was when the Bombay terror attacks happened. And that was a big inflection point in my life. We were working in Prabha Devi. That's where the office was. We were actually supposed to go that evening to celebrate something to South Bombay at Leopold Cafe. And then as we were making our plans, we all started getting calls and there was news being like, there's something happening, you cannot go. So we said, okay, let's go to Bandra instead. But then while we were reaching to Bandra, everyone was like, I think you should go home. Things seem pretty bad. And there was a sense of fear for the first time that in my memory, that I was grappled with, like very unknown, like something is happening that you can't control. And I still remember that feeling really well. I reached home And for about 4 days, we watched this terror unfold on TV, right? And then after 4 days, I got a message from like HR, okay, offices have opened now and you can come back. I remember texting my father and saying, I don't think I can just go back to work and pretend like nothing happened. Like we just went through some major trauma in the last 4 days, all of us collectively. My father was working somewhere else. He had to live there. He couldn't travel. Me and my mom were alone at home. We were just like, what is happening? It was pretty bad. And then there was a lot of chatter among friends being like, how can people, be designed or built to destroy other humans? Like, how does one reach that point? What kind of trauma do they go through, etc.? So a lot of like this conversation that was happening. And I knew then that, okay, I don't think I want to be in a cushy corporate job. I really want to figure out, how we can contribute to change. And around that same time is when Teach for India launched the first ad to apply for the fellowship. And I thought it was perfect because it was 2 years. I'll do it for 2 years. I'll see if it's really my thing. I will continue. Otherwise, I will come back. Honestly, till the last day, May 2nd was my last day at work. I was kind of hoping that my boss was like, "May, don't go, stay back after I put in my papers," because I was very scared because it was a big radical change, but pushed myself and I was like, no, okay, I've signed up and we'll go for it. And of course, change my life.
Yeah, because I know Teach for India from such close quarters, Shrutika, I know how transformative that experience would have been for you. What were some of the things, other than obviously being raised by the idealism to bring about change, that you really were able to learn on the ground?
I think the fellowship or that moment and it doesn't have to be a fellowship. I think for different folks, it can be different things. But it was this first time where you're truly immersing yourself into something selfless, where it's really not about what you're getting at the end of the day. I think when it was working or you're at college or it's all about your grades, your paycheck, your promotion, something that's going to add to elevate your status in different ways. But I think in the fellowship and in the classroom, it was a little bit about, is that child learning? Is that community better today? Is that school better today? For me, it was like this truest selfless experience that I have ever gotten. And I think that just radically shifted and it cemented to me saying, this is what I want to do. I want to be here. But of course, I wasn't like on the spectrum of social work, I wasn't like the Gandhian kind of go and, dedicate and stay in the community. I also wanted to enjoy my life. I wanted to travel. I wanted to explore. I wanted to be financially stable, independent, etc. So it was all about also finding out the path to be able to do some of that. But yeah, that was definitely one of the things around the fellowship.
Yeah. And then you went on to stay within the sector. And what prompted that? Because first you said that, I'll try and do this for 2 years and see if this is for me or not. But then you made a conscious choice to stay in the sector and contribute first within Teach for India and then at other places. So what prompted that decision?
I think it was that moment in the fellowship where I was very clear, this is the most joy that I have gotten. And again, I began to discover that about myself, that I like working with people, that I like helping, teaching, coaching, all of that. It really gave me the opportunity to do that and I wanted to do more of that. And for me, it was taking some of the business skills, some of the technical skills that I might have learned in the result of my business school, etc., into the sector. Because the sector definitely, there was still an impression, and I think if you ask my parents now, so they'll be like, we had no idea what she was doing, because there's still an impression being like, you're a social worker, like the jhola types, But the sector was pushing to sort of be like, no, we have to bring a lot of sophistication, a lot of, have the right cadre of people, right talent, etc. And how can we attract the best talent? Because to really solve the most difficult problems, you need the best people. So I think I was at the cusp of a little bit of that change. It wasn't the jhola type thing, but also about how can you bring some of these sophisticated technical skills that you would otherwise, corporate sector into the social sector. And I was quite sort of, excited by that challenge. So that's why I said, okay, I'll continue. And then I stayed on into like a more training and development role, which was again training, coaching, teaching, and working with people. So it was for me, I learned that about myself. And honestly, I wouldn't have had I not experimented so much. Otherwise, I feel like in a different alternate universe, I would be HR and I don't know how my life would have been that way. But for me, this worked out.
And I know you met your husband, Danny, during the fellowship years. How involved has Danny been in your career decisions? He was in the same space for a few years before he started out on his own. But how much of your career do you discuss with each other, the decisions you take and what he would do in his professional life versus what you choose to do?
So I think Dan and me have been like really true partners, right? Like we run decisions by each other. We take decisions collectively. So for me, he has had a really big role to play in terms of my career decisions. When I finished, Teach for India and then ISLI, which was another job that I had, I realized I wanted to study further. And so I wanted to go to Singapore because that was where I was getting full scholarship. But that would, for him, it would mean moving out of Bombay and India where he was sort of holding his job. But he asked for that flexibility. He got that flexibility and he was with me in Singapore working from there. It also did mean that for him, it was a bit of a career step back, right? Because you're not in the thick of things if you're at the headquarters or in your office and you're kind of working remotely. He really didn't think twice about it. He was like, that would be fantastic. You go study and, I'll work out of there and we'll figure it out. It's important for you. And so I feel like it was never like a discussion to be like, oh, what does it mean and how, etc. It was sort of like, sure, it's your career, you'll support it. When it is his career, I will support it. So it was sort of worked out that way. And now I got a lot of messages from other girls then being like, and your husband moved there with you? Because often it's the other way around, where like when you're married, you will move where your husband's work needs to, etc. It didn't even occur as a oh, this is like not the norm. Kind of just happened, and it was great for us. But I know that it was hard for him, not in the sense that he didn't need to justify, but like I know there were like people would question this, right? Like, oh, that's odd. Like your wife is going to study, and what are you doing on campus?
No, I would tell you, this is definitely an exception to find like, a true partner who would be very, very open and supportive of you finding your truest potential. So kudos to Dan on that. I often talk about, and sometimes like a broken record about how each one of us at the very least should have a right to choose. And through the years of being married, you chose to become a mother. How did this choice change you as a person, as a professional? Tell me about both the good parts and the struggles that came along with it.
Yeah. So I was very clear that I wanted a child. And for me, something I thought of is something that I knew I wanted. Perhaps it was a strong, like kind of a biological urge as a woman to be like, I want to go through birthing and, have a baby, etc. But I also knew from having worked with children in the community, the potential of bringing up a child with the right values and the right kind of ecosystem. So for me, it was all of that, a bit of, again, my, nurturing, coaching, kind of that kind of instinct of mine working really strongly. So for me, it was very strong. Yes, I want to be a mom. But my husband did not want. So Dan wasn't very sure about this. He went from no to unsure for multiple reasons, of course. But I think another strong one for him was that, and he's very open about it, is he struggles with mental health. And so it's a little bit about what does this mean in terms of me being a father, or even because it's hereditary, what does it mean in terms of passing it on to the child? So I think those were some very real questions we were grappling with. I remember asking our doctors also, and our doctor was really great. And he said, mental health is no reason why you should not have a child. Like there's nothing, there are ways to manage it. So you shouldn't think of it from that way. Of course, you should think about from many other reasons, like financial possibly would be one of the biggest things that you think about. So for us, slowly we went on the journey of me being sure, him being unsure, to finally coming to a point saying that, okay, we'll have a baby. We went through one miscarriage though. We went through it. The fact that we wanted a child became even more stronger because we came very close to having the child, and then due to some complications it almost like it disappeared. And so it was a very hard time for us. We had to take a break from trying for 6 months, and we decided we'll travel, we take a step back. But we came back knowing fully well that no, we want to have a child. And then I got pregnant again, and we were like, okay, great. Again, not a very smooth journey to having a child, but I think it was like the universe was almost pushing us to be like, are you sure? And now we joke about it being like, it was Nia, that is my daughter, and she was like, okay, why don't you all just go take a break and like think about it and I'll be back. And then she kind of came back. So that's a little bit of just how that journey was. But when Nia was born, she celebrated her first birthday in lockdown, and like everything changed. It was a very difficult, and much of it I'm still processing about what it meant to bring a child in the times of COVID.
Was motherhood and embracing a child, did it all become magical from the get-go? And were your motherly instincts and bonds with your daughter were there from all the way when you had her in your arms? Or because there were other expectations of being at job and running a household, did that affect the kind of bond you initially shared with Nia?
So I was a very involved, and I still am a very protective mother. So I think for me, I immediately felt that connect to Nia, but I also think it has a lot to do with just my general kind of people working with children kind of instinct. So for me, it was like my own child, and I did connect very strongly to it. But there was this whole parallel thought that was running in my mind was about work. It was a little bit about what does this mean in terms of work? Am I going to be able to go back to work? How do I go back to work? Like this, like my mind was like running 2x. To the point that now when I look back, I find it very silly, but I actually said that, and I did. I said I'll go back in 4 months. I know I have a 6 months maternity leave, but I don't want to be out of the game for so long. So I was a breastfeeding mother, and at 3 months, I was training my child how to drink out of a cup. And it was torture for the child. It was torture for me because I would hear her crying. But I was like, no, Nia, you have to learn how to do this, and I have to be okay with it because I want to go back to work. And I went back to work at the 4th month. I worked out an arrangement where it was like I work few days, and then few days I'll continue my maternity leave and like extend it out a little bit. I don't know why I did that, but I was like a little bit of, I don't want this fear of missing out, that I've worked so hard to come to where I am now. Like all these choices that I've taken, these paths I've traversed, I finally feel like I have it together. I don't want maternity to like put me back on the burner. While I was going into maternity, you start handing over the projects, you start giving away things. So it was a bit like, you're not now kind of coming back, or you're not going to be here for 6 months, and a lot can change in 6 months. Nobody said that, but you were subtly kind of picking all of that up. Honestly, I don't blame organizations or companies that much, because many women do go on maternity leave and don't come back. And they have the choice to do that. But it really creates this undercurrent of, you don't know if this one is going to come back. So let's not put most important client or the biggest project on her shoulders right now. Things are going to change.
So help me understand, Shrutika, you had the opportunity of taking a 6 months paid maternity leave, and out of your choice, which was coming from a little bit of a place of missing out and fear that you would not be able to play the catch-up game in your career, you came back in the 4th month.
Yeah.
Letting go of those 2 additional months. Help me understand, like as women, why does that constant fear of missing out or proving ourselves to others still exist? Like we're talking about 2022. And I would totally, understand if it was coming from someone who was not as competent or as accomplished as you, but someone who I have seen closely say things like that, like about herself and about like whether she'd be considered for a really important project if she stayed on, to complete her legit maternity break.
I mean, I'm trying to find the right words, but I think a lot of it was just self-doubt. And a lot of it was being self-conscious. And I have over the years, worked and mentored many young women. And I realized this is a common thread in many girls and many women. This whole thing about second guessing yourself, this whole thing where I'm not sure if I have it together. And I think growing up, it was a little bit of that, right? Like I wasn't the best student. I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was still figuring out. I was always like, I don't know what she's going to do with her life kind of a thing. Even when I did go to social sector, it was like, yeah, no wonder you chose social sector, because it's so easy where you will work so hard. And like, so I think there was a lot of this thought that I had built in my head where I was like, I really need to push the envelope. I really need to break the barriers. I cannot be okay with conforming to what the society or anything says about women in general. And I'm like, I cannot be that. I have to prove extra. So yes, I will not only be back in 6 months, I'll be back in 4 months. When most women don't come back in 6 months. So I don't know, this is something that I built in my head, which was a result of all the, again, subtle chatter in the ecosystem. I can do a little bit more and a little bit more. The minute you start bucketing me into the construct of what, hey, you're going to be a mother now, of course that's important for your life, so you're not going to think so much about work and it's okay. And I'll be like, no, I will think 100 times more about work now. You see, it's something in my head that I had built. And of course, it all fell flat on my face because I went in and in 2 months we had COVID. And so we went to lockdown and I was like parenting full time with no help. And it was extremely complicated, but it's a lesson for myself also. But that was a little bit of where that was coming from.
I want to shift gears and talk a little bit about the role of your partner, as you became a mother. And I know I have the privilege to know Dan a little bit. And so I know he's an equally available, involved parent in raising your daughter, both physically and emotionally. I'm sure you're not surprised to know that that's more of a exception than a norm. How were the initial days for both of you to find your rhythm to this journey of parenthood? Like, how did your relationship with Dan evolve as a result of a new human in your life now? And what kind of frictions and adjustments that you both had to go through to figure out this?
Yeah. So 100% Dan is a very involved parent. He has taken some conscious decisions in his life that also allow him to be around our daughter more and do the things that he wants to, pick her up from school, drop her to school, etc. But it didn't happen overnight. I think there were a lot of things that contributed to it. But between us, as husband and wife, we did go through a fair bit of struggles to arrive at a point that I felt like there was some amount of equality in how we were running the house or parenting. I don't think there was ever a point where Dan was never involved. I think his default was always, I want to be around. I do think it was also because he had exposure to a lot of global colleagues of his. Think about a Dutch father or a Scandinavian father. They are very like, you grow up in that ecosystem where there is a lot of responsibility that fathers take for their children. I think he was exposed to a lot of that, which in my mind is different if you're working in a more traditional corporate setup where in India, where mostly it's men coming to work and, women at home trying to manage children. So I think for him, that was very much like something that he was exposed to and he wanted to do. And also because we went through this journey of thinking through and making the choice of bringing a child into the world, and not like, now we're 35 or whatever, you have to bring a child. Like, it was like something we really thought about, something we worked towards. We went through our own kind of like the miscarriage and having a baby. So for us, it was like really like a very precious moment. And having that child meant like, okay, now she's here. Now she better get your full attention, right? And now not this half-baked thing won't happen. So I think that was a lot that also contributed to it. He is, of course, fairly involved. But there were a few more things for us to get together in terms of running the house, doing the chores. When do I get my time? When do you get your time? Self-time. And that took a lot of conversation, a lot of fights, arguments for us to come to a place where we are now able to find a balance. And I think for me, it was also being aware that I go into this massive defense mode when I'm being again typecast as this typical mother who has to. It's like my mom would still say, but you're the woman of the house, you have to take the decision. I would be like, no, it really doesn't have to be that way. So I take on this extra sensitivity to that. So some of it would come out. So I also had to kind of balance myself. And kind of be like, okay, some of this I will do, some of this you will do, and where do I get some of my time? And we had to work on it to kind of get to where we are. There's no magic bullet, unfortunately.
Yeah. So for Nia, like when her mommy and daddy both are out there making the world a better place, how do you make up for the distractedness or the unavailability to your daughter? How do you take turns to make sure that you are fully present in the moment for her?
I think it's honestly, because it's only beginning to happen now, because for 2 years we were all working from home and in lockdown. In fact, that had its own challenge because I was around her a lot by the virtue of just being in this work from home and lockdown situation, to the point that I was breastfeeding her till about 3 years, like 2.5 to 2 years, 8 months. And breastfeeding is exhausting. It's trying to find the space to breastfeed within meetings, to breastfeed when she wakes up. And it is also sucking a lot of nutrition out of the mother. And there's not enough awareness, I feel, on if you want to continue to breastfeed your child, you need other support systems to work. And we were living in a pandemic. So in my mind, I was like, if I want a healthy child, I better breastfeed this child. My struggles actually came from being surrounded a lot with her, that I was just not finding the space enough to be by myself. And I really needed to be by myself because I'm not going to work. We were working from home. Parks were closed. Things, no gatherings, no events, nothing. We're just around a lot. And she was like quite attached to mommy. I think now when everything opened up, it's almost like she's ready now to let me go, and I'm ready to also like step away from her. So it came almost at a time where we're both like, okay, I've spent plenty time with her, which normally I wouldn't have got if I was like back to work in 6 months traveling. I was in fact supposed to travel in April 2020 to Jharkhand for a project, and I was discussing with my husband how to night wean her from breastfeeding. And March 24th, we went into lockdown. I was like, no point. Now I am getting that space, and it's a space that I think she needs and I also need.
Yeah,
and she understands that. And so when I'm back from work, then I'm like fully with her.
Shrutika, I've known you for being someone who doesn't shy away from being ambitious, right? Like you've said that yourself. And you don't believe that the word ambitious itself means aggressive and it has a negative connotation when it's attached to a woman. You are passionate about the work because it gives you the identity, the purpose, the money, and everything in between. And this passion and need doesn't necessarily need to magically disappear with the arrival of a baby. Did you ever contemplate giving up your career, even after you chose to go back in the 4th month, because it was just too much to handle, all of it?
Yeah, I think it definitely was too much to handle when we lost all help. Like, you couldn't have any nannies at home. Nobody could come home. I was waking up with her giving her a bath, making her breakfast, then taking a call. Then my husband would make lunch. Then I would be with her while he would take, like, it was like this nightmare situation. And we were in it for some time. And work was only ramping up. And I was expected to, of course, step in because you're, come back from maternity leave. And I was also like, give me more, I can do it. A little bit of that ambitious drive. I found it really hard. I burnt out. I think there was a point, I called you at that point as well. I completely burnt out to the point that it took me some time to recognize that I am burnt out. I started doing things like I was procrastinating. I was finding it difficult to get out of bed a little bit. I was just like not seeing joy in things. That when I had an honest conversation with my boss then, there was an opportunity to discuss about, okay, do you just want to go back to working 2 days a week? So we'll just put you on a consultant role. And I was like, shit, I have worked so hard and now I'm just not going to have a job and I'm going to work. Like all my radars went up and it was a very difficult time. Around the same time, there was like, promotions happening, rewards and recognitions happening. And I was obviously getting none of it because I was really struggling to make both work and home needs met. At that point, I was like, what should I do? Should I really just make the choice to step out or should I continue? And I think what really helped was like reaching out to other women. I spoke to you, some others, and I got some fantastic advice that really rooted me a bit, right? And a couple of things that I think I took away from that is, one of the things is I remember speaking to you and actually getting some validation on the fact like this mommy fatigue is real or this brain fog is real. Like I was just slow at work. I would normally multitask really well, but I was just like, why is this getting me so much time, taking me so much time to go through something? And it's a real struggle, which again, I didn't know. I thought I was becoming dumb, losing my, metal or something. But I was like, okay, this has got to do with being in this parent zone of a newborn. When I spoke to another working mom, she was like, you won't get promoted this year. You may get promoted next year. In the larger scheme of things, it really doesn't matter. It's not like you got promoted in 2020, not in 2019. Like if you need the time to be with yourself right now, you need to prioritize that. So I think all of that I heard and I was just, let's do what I want to do. I discussed a lot with my husband. I realized leaving work would make me go even crazy. Like I think I would take that as almost like a failure on myself, which something that I was almost kind of also being like, pata tha. This happens to moms, like, and I'm like, no, we have to try and change this construct. So for me, it was very important to try and make it work. But then somebody gave me really good advice saying, go slow to go fast. So then I was like, okay, I'm just going to take my time. Asked for change in projects, change in teams. I said, I'm going to stick it out. It was really, really hard. At that point, it seemed like a better option to quit and move. But I was like, no, I'm going to stick it out. I did. And now I'm promoted. And now I'm working on some of the important projects and clients. And I feel like things take its time. At that time, when you're in the middle of it, it just feels like all hell is about to break loose. But I had to stick to my guns. And quitting was non-negotiable for me because I think that would have just taken a big toll on both my mental and emotional state. But okay, I gave up some things. I said, I'll take it slow. I won't do this project. I started saying no to things, which also created an impression, of course. And so I lost out on the promotion perhaps that year. But then I made up for it later.
Sometimes people, just fail to realize that, the choice to work in social sector where resources are stretched, problems are harder, and the work that one does is not just physically and intellectually consuming, but it's also emotionally draining because you get to work with some of the hardest problems and you're trying to find solutions. Would you agree? Is that?
Yeah, and I think in COVID, it was worse because communities were literally dying. And if children couldn't go to school, elderly folks were dying, medication was not there. And so we who kind of do a lot of that provision for communities went on like, we have to be 100% available now. We're trying to work with NGOs, we're trying to see what they need. But in that whole process, you forget what do you need and your family needs. So there was work was just going up, which is like more and more work was coming. But it was just like, okay, how are you going to try and make all of that possible while trying to take care of your own needs? And again, someone said, you have to first put the mask, in an airplane, we're going down the crash, you put a mask for yourself and then for your child. So I was like, first you have to take care of yourself. Are you fully available, healthy and able to manage this? Then only you can serve others and do that well. So that was a little bit of my learning also from that. But yeah, the social sector, it was like 2x times everything when we were in COVID.
Yeah. Shrutika, you've, prioritized yourself, you've, made time for your daughter. But there's another nuance to your story, which is around you had to be available emotionally for your husband. And Dan has spoken about this very openly in the recent times, where he was struggling with his mental health. And there was a phase in his life where he needed a lot more from you and of you. To the extent you're comfortable, would love to hear, how did you, continue to be an ambitious person at work and manage to be a available partner for Dan?
Yeah, this is like thinking this was like 6 months in, not 6, maybe about a year into our marriage that Dan had his first episode. And he also didn't know what was happening to him, much less me. And I was just like suddenly, noticing this change in his personality, in his choices, and how he's speaking. Much later, of course, we figured out that he was diagnosed as bipolar, and he openly shares about that. It was all fine for that few months. When you're bipolar, you're sort of in that high phase when it's still okay. I think the tough part is when you hit depression. So Dan was suffering from depression for some time, to the point that, again, he couldn't get out of bed, he couldn't take a shower, he would try to go to work and he would return. He would like halfway and be like, I don't think I can make it into work today, and he would come back. I think for me, one, I was just equipped with some of this information because I had done my master's in psychology and I knew a little bit of what this means. But somehow for me, I was able to focus on what he needed at that point and not so much on everything else that was going on, or like, be it like simple things like, does this mean he's going to lose his job? And I was Googling at that time, and it'll be like 70% of all couples who have like somebody who's bipolar end up in divorce. And I'm just like, oh my God, I should not Google. It doesn't help. It was just something about just being present, knowing Dan more than his illness was what was important to focus on. And, with God's grace and right medication and of course the right kind of support. And we had an open line of communication at that point about how he was feeling, how I was feeling, what that meant, how we together come out of this. And we didn't tell a lot of people, obviously, because at that time when it happened. So not like I could go to my parents and be like, okay, we need help or something, because there's so much stigma around all of this. So we had to do this alone. So almost like in a secret chamber, we were trying to figure this out. But it worked. I think for us, it was important that we knew each other more than just, that time that all of this illness was going through. We've been through a lot together. We've been through the fellowship. We knew each other as friends and then as husband and wife. And we just had to focus on that. He talks about it this way, as like this dark cloud, which will then disappear. So it was just that dark cloud moment. You have to focus on the sun and the sunshine that will come, which is a lot of our relationship, everything we had been together and what we wanted to do as well. Really, I do think at that point there is some good karma and luck. Like a lot of people who go through this, sometimes meds don't kick in very early. You don't get that right kind of support early. Sometimes you don't get the right doctors. But for us, everything lined up. And Dan, of course, chose to make then very drastic lifestyle changes in terms of how he sleeps, what he eats. That has collectively contributed to us coming out of this, to the point now that he obviously now shares about his journey with others in a way to give them hope, having been through it himself.
I think Dan rightfully gives you a lot of credit for helping him through his journey. And I think, again, it's more of an exception than a norm that people are lucky to find partners like that. Shrutika, before I let you go, I want to hear from you one piece of advice that you would give to another woman who wants to have a career while feeling that she's a reasonably successful mother, if she chooses to be one.
I think for me, the one advice that I will give is to really be okay with wanting to have it all, but you may not have it all at the same time. And to me, I think that's how I want to live my life, is I don't want to compromise on anything. And this thing about choice, I always push to be like, how much truly is it your choice? Because there's so much chatter, there's so much conversation, there's so much bias that you feel like you've made the choice, but just ask yourself, did you really make that choice, right?
Thank you so much, Shrutika. That was a very candid and a vulnerable conversation. I'm sure the listeners will enjoy as much as I've enjoyed having this talk with you. And that was the episode of Just an Ordinary Mom podcast. Thank you so much to Shrutika Jadhav for taking the time to be on the show. If you're an ordinary mom or know someone who could benefit from listening to this podcast, do share it with them. This podcast was recorded at Manic Pod Studio in Chembur. Our sound engineer is Shrey Tiwari and our producer is Vedant Nayak. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mridvika.
Thanks, Shrutika.